Hey folks, back with another video. Now in this video I'm going to be talking about Jordan B. Peterson's podcast he did with Douglas Murray. In this video I'm just going to present my view on the important points and ideas discussed. So let's dive in. Now starting the conversation, Professor Peterson talked about grand narratives. He brought the grand narrative, two of them, one of them being the promised land and the other being the infidel. Now, the promised land is generally the grand narrative of, you know, the Moses uh, and how he promised his people a promised land. But the infidel narrative seems to be something we as a society in the West are going through. I talked about the infidel as a us versus them. Now, why we have reached to such a uh, sort of an environment in the West, it has to do with the fact that we may actually be suffering from prosperity. Now, this is something Professor brought up, and I think that he has a point there that we in the West are suffering from our own prosperity. Of course, he also talked about how the conservatives are generally suspicious of grand narratives, and makes sense since conservatives generally have come up with principles and values that have a built up over let's just say decades, if not centuries, of past lessons. While the center left, generally the current liberal, has been a narrative. They don't have a particular grand narrative except that they have a message which is an incremental change. However, the radicals, these are the people who are the most attracted to the grand narratives. And one of the, let's just say, the downside to the radicals is the fact that they are ignorant of how society functions. So currently, the us versus them, the infidel grand narrative, is something that the radicals are attracted to, and they are the ones who are, because they're living this kind of a grand narrative, they're pushing for their kind of whatever they seem the solution to this problem. And of course, because they are radicals and they are ignorant of how society functions, they are causing a bigger problem. Now, the other, let's just say, the big theme in their discussion was the left-right divide. Now, this is something Douglas Murray brought up, was the fact that the right has generally been concerned with economics. And as I talked about in the last slide, is that because we are currently in compared to the rest of the world, the West is going through uh, the benefits of the good economic policies of the past, that the goodness of such economies, the prosperity, has become invisible to us. Put it in a different way, we have become accustomed to the kind of, let's just say, luxury compared to the rest of the world that we think is just a norm, but it is a luxury. The peace and prosperity that we in the West have experienced, while personally I think we could have more, but the degree to which we already have itself is amazing. We must, I have to say, I still, to an extent, am grateful to the good economy that we have in the West. Of course, there is a downside to the conservatism is that the conservative ideas generally do not work for those who individuals who have failed. And so such people tend to be attracted to the left. So, however, Douglas Murray also brought up another point that which is that the right is not concerned with the question of meaning. The right tends to say that the meaning question is something that should be left to the individual, and I agree with the right on this. The question of meaning has to be left to the individual. The In my opinion, if we start getting the answer to meaning from other than ourselves, we as an individual and broadly, of course, as a society, are open to a kind of we go down the path of either we're going the Holocaust or the gulags. So yes, on this, I think the right has it. Well, they got it correct that the meaning should be left to the individual. Of course, Professor Peterson also noted the fact that religion within the left has collapsed more than the right, and because of such a thing, the left is currently replacing religion with identity politics. And this is a topic I will talk about later on in the slide. What exactly some of the points of the identity politics. Of course, one of the issues that the left does bring, which is an important issue and is also a difficult issue to deal with, is the idea of inequality. Now, Professor Peterson has talked about how much inequality should a society accept for the economic prosperity. There seems to be some kind of a seesaw. Like there has to be a certain amount. If you want a a prosperous country, you're gonna have to tolerate a certain amount of inequality. But as of yet, the left seems to have solutions that make the inequality worse. They have not come up with a good solution to the current inequality that we have in the West. And in my opinion, the inequality in the West is far less than in the rest of the world, where inequality is. If you were to exclude the Western countries, developed countries, and then just look at the inequalities of the rest of the world, it is just unbelievable the amount of inequality they have. And weirdly enough, they also seem to have a poor economy. So there seems to be that if inequality does go out of control, it also takes the economy with it. But it seems to have some kind of a golden mean that if you try to also reduce inequality, we also tend to also destroy the economy. There seems to be some kind of a let's just say a Goldilocks zones of inequality itself. That if it gets too much disturbed, either way, the economy suffers. But in the quest to end inequality, we cannot have an absolute no economy. However, of course, that conversation then, of course, led into the idea that in the other things where the left and the right were divided. Now, the right has this current, how should we say, an overestimation of the. They have overestimated the proximity of communism to the society. Now, of course, Douglas Murray did ask Professor Peterson that you were someone who's warning about communism, but of course, Peterson has said that his particular thing he explained was he was talking about how communism, the academic institutions are being, um, let's just say, intellectually raided by, or they are smuggling in communism through the back door in the name, from this ideology, where the ideology of postmodernism has married the ideology of Marxism, and they have created this, sort of a neo-Marxism that has come out of this. And of course, Professor Peterson's point is well taken. He's warning about communism within the institutional march that is happening, and it is currently now impacting society. And he was warning, and we are currently going down that path, and we're taking the path of cultural revolution type. We are in the West, and particularly in America, the the West is going through a form of cultural revolution that the Chinese had to suffer under Mao's rule. Of course, equally, the left has also overestimated the proximity of fascism to the society. Now, while the threat of fascism is less than communism, the threat does exist, even though it's small. And the reason is that, in my opinion, fascism is the threat of fascism is because there's going to be a reaction to the communist. And of course, over the year, we saw how we had the communists come out in full force, and that there were, of course, in past incidents where the fascists and the communists did fight it out in the streets. And while it will, I think, in the coming days, weeks, months, it's going to calm down for some time, but I think the threat is still there. Of course, then the conversation moved forward into identity. Now, according to Professor Peterson, identity is based on experience with roots in biology, meaning we have experiences that we generally have, and those experiences also interact with our biological makeup, let's just say. And so, two people with the same experience but different biology will, due to that, form a different identity. Even though it's not going to be a major difference between the two, but that's the general idea, as per my understanding. Now, I could be definitely wrong on this. So, and of course, this is another point that Professor Peterson makes from time to time, is the fact that the individual is both crushed and made by society. That is, that we as individuals are, in a certain sense, savages that become civilized through our interactions with the society, which punishes us, meaning crushes us when we do something wrong according to the diktats of the society, but then also rewards us when we do good. Now, of course, the society also has a bit of the impact of, and when I talk about society, I mean the group of individuals and around us, and the general ideas that are accepted. Now, of course, society also gets, ever so slightly crushed by an individual, and also is made up of individuals. And certain individuals, they do great things and they radically do change society. So I think, while the professor brought up how society makes the individual, I want to also give the individual the credit that sometimes the individual can also shape society. Now, of course, another way he talked about the identity is the fact that he views identity as sort of as something like a set of tools or guidelines, you know, and these tools and guidelines help us to, determine how to act in the world, or like how to act in the particular situations we are, how we interact with other individuals, how we act with institutions, all that sort of thing. And so identity plays an important part on our interaction with the world. And on top of that, he also talks about how stories also build our identity. Now, stories provide us or give us access to other people's experience. And this is, I think, was a very important point, because if stories, and this is maybe one of the reasons why the young kids love to hear stories, whichever one, as long as the stories have some kind of a arc. The kids seem to love stories, and I think to an extent we all do love stories. We seem to never really get, um, although as we grow, our stories become more and more, let's say, hidden. They become very, um, I'll just leave it at that. Just they become very hidden, and that we are also partially the stories, which is the access to other people's experience, also plays into our identity. Now, of course, since I talked about identity, I'm going to have to talk about identity politics. Now, the identity politics crowd, according to these people's discussion, and I generally think they were right, is that the proponents of identity politics generally concentrate on race, gender, and sexuality. And of course, this is something that Murray, Douglas Murray, talked about, is the fact that the identity politics crowds basically mixes both the hardware with the software. They don't seem to understand that there's a hardware and a software, and that you cannot mix the two up. And this is something the identity politics does. Uh, it does commit that error, and I think to an extent he's right. Now, according to the identity politics proponents, identity, according to them, is based on our subjective or quote unquote lived experiences only. And here is uh, where they are wrong. Because while it is true that identity is based on our subjective experiences or our lived experiences, but it is not the only factor. It is one of many factors that determines our identity. And of course, there is a paradox within the identity politics. Namely, there's this idea that this is something Douglas Murray talked about, is that on the one hand, they say, you must understand me. And simultaneously, they also say, you can never understand me. And of course, having such a paradox is the reason why, you know, I personally cannot take them seriously. And this kind of a contradiction in this kind of to bring paradoxes, and in my opinion this is an unnecessary paradox, and this to even propose such kind of an idea is, in my opinion, just stupidity to begin with, if nothing else. And of course, this is something that Professor Peterson has basically rejects, and so do I, and so does anyone who will, once he reads these kind of if you think that this paradox is a recipe for anything good, then look around you, it's not good. Anyhow, Then, of course, the conversation moved into, and the other theme that emerged was the election of 2016. Now, according to Professor Peterson, Hillary Clinton had lost in 2016, and that it wasn't Donald Trump who won. And I agree with this absolutely. I don't think Donald Trump really won as much as Hillary lost. A lot of people, were saying that Hillary Clinton is worse than Donald Trump. And this is something that Professor Peterson also brought up, was the fact that both Mrs. Clinton and Mr. Trump were candidates of resentment. They were not candidates of anything like there were change, but resentment was a bigger part of their candidacy. Now with Trump, it's and with Clinton, it is quite that was something I did not. I mean, I kind of at a certain level, I did sort of understood at the time, but now looking back, it is clear that they were candidates of resentment, because I mean, you had Mrs. Clinton saying, why am I not 50 points ahead?" or calling her opponent's base as a basket of deplorables. I mean, that sounds that doesn't sound like a positive message. She didn't have a positive message. Her message was, "I'm with her." Trump, in a sense, did have a little bit of a positive message, saying he's going to make America great. Let's leave aside whether he, you know, did or not. But of course, Trump had an additional appeal, which was he was the candidate of chaos. He was the candidate that said, if you don't like what's going around you, you vote for me. I mean, he was, in effect, a middle finger to, let's just say, the quote unquote establishment. And of course, this is something Professor Peterson brought up, and I'm gonna have to. I mean, it does seem at a certain level that it is right that the left hates the right for allowing Trump to win. And because of that, the left did not recognize their 2016 defeat, because it doesn't seem to. I mean, every action since the election of 2016 till now vindicates the point that the left did not recognize that they were defeated. And an important, I think, thing that Professor Peterson said was, one must recognize their loss in order to love again. And I think in the last 4 years, a good message to the left should have been, you must recognize your loss in order to live again. And now I think I can say the same message to the right, that you must recognize your loss in order to not just live again, but also maybe win again. Also, both to the left and the right. Accept that you've made mistakes, recognize them, and learn from them so you can live again and maybe even win again. And now, naturally, the conversation moved on to the 2020 election. Now, the main issue of the 2020 election was the economy versus the public health. The right basically became the party of economy, and the left became the party of the public health. And now that, coupled with, locking down people in their houses, created what I think they got right, is that the internet locked up people, drove people mad. And now keep in mind, the internet is filled up with people with paranoia, they have their conspiracy theorists, there are people with resentment, And all of this, you know, together created multiple rabbit holes in the internet. There is so much, like, so much content on the internet from all sides. And of course, there are multiple rabbit holes in the internet that people, and of course, and people with these kinds of slightly paranoia, having a bit of conspiracy and resentment, they are, you know, they're being driven mad by the internet. And while, you know, how should I say, maybe, you know, they are being driven mad, but what is driving them further mad is in my opinion, is how the, let's just say, the corporate press and the internet censorship has also exacerbated the problem. And it is further fueling the paranoia, the conspiracies, and resentments, and it's now building rabbit holes that are not out in the open but in the underground. And this is going to be bad. This is just a recipe for a disaster. Of course, we also saw in last year, and this is something that Professor Peterson brought up, was the fact that the left has excused violence from their side. They have made not just excuses, they have spent money trying to bail them out after they had been arrested or detained, And one other thing, this is something Professor Peterson brought up, was this idea that, which I think he's kind of right about, which is that the margin of victory, and this is in the battleground states, was within the margin of error. And of course, that is something, a lot of the, let's say, the pollsters did not get. A lot of the pollsters were generally saying that Biden was going to win, but with a wider margin. However, the margins were quite thin, to say the least. And of course, that is, how should we put, that was a little bit more, that was more fuel to the fire. And of course, what happened after the 2020 election. Now, according to Professor Peterson, he thinks that Donald Trump's actions were reckless. On this point, I am personally am mixed, but he talked about the fact that he challenged the results. Now, as my own view on this is that anyone who wins, if he feels that he has been cheated, he should pursue all the legal avenues, which Donald Trump did pursue. But of course, if you pursue the legal avenues and you don't get any particular results, then you have basically got two choices: accept it and just go, like, move on, or you're gonna continue to fight. And it seems that Donald Trump chose to continue to fight, which of course resulted in the January 6th protest turning into riots. Now, I think there is another problem as well. This is not, which is that Donald Trump seems to have this problem of failing to understand the broad context. He did not, he should have realized that he has a large crowd in front of the Capitol Hill, and that his message should have been sweet, simple and sweet. And of course, him being who he is, he tends to speak from the hip, let's just say. He doesn't do a lot of prepared speech. And I think he did do prepared speech on this, but still, it seems that the left has continued to take Donald Trump literally but not seriously. And it happened on January 6th. And the incident of January 6th are, while the left is trying to pin Donald Trump, I don't think they, not reasonably, you cannot reasonably pin it to Donald Trump. However, he did say some, let's just say, fiery language, in particular in regards to his vice president. However, this is something that Professor Peterson brought, which is that for those people who believe that Donald Trump has won, according to him, they would have to believe that Trump is a paragon of virtue. Now, I didn't quite, how should I say, understand the point, but I thought it is important to uh, keep this, and hopefully you people in the crowd can explain to me what he meant there, because I did not I did not understand that point, but you know, he did mention and it did catch my eye, so I'd have to put it there. And it is also to believe that the institutions have failed or have become corrupt. And this is something that Professor Peterson says is not possible. The institutions have not failed, they are not corrupt. I mean, sure, there's a bit of corruption in all institutions, which is a bit of corruption is just, it's just, it's impossible to have perfect institutions, but there's a threshold. And even I agree with Professor Peterson that the institutions in the West they have not crossed a threshold where we'd call them corrupt. However, each institution has its own inbuilt, let's just say, mechanism of deterioration, or how should we put it? There seems to be an entropy principle that operates within institutions, which means that each institution is eventually is going to get, you know, it, it's going to exist, but time's going to move on, situations are going to change. They're going to turn the institution as something out of date, and they need constant, how should we say, upgrades. And so there's a good case to be made that our institutions are, um, they need new updates, and we need good updates. You know, no, we don't need updates for the sake of updates, but rather updates um, that are consistent with both the general principle, that are within the ethical principle, but also address the current issue and not the made up issues. Of course, towards the end, um, let's what were some of the things that they thought were an advice for moving forward. Now, in this slide, I've also put in some sort of the understanding of the current environment and all that. Anyway, so currently, the situation is such that normal discourse has ended amongst the populace, and of course, that thing is the reason why people is the reason why internet is driving people mad. Is because people are staying on the internet longer, and a lot of people are having conversations in internet with people anonymously, let's just say. And of course, it is unknown to what extent the conversation is just a bunch of trolls, and to what extent are these people serious. It is difficult. So I don't envy the people who are trying to decipher which is which. And naturally, this is, um, I mean, of course, when conversation between people ceases, eventually you're gonna put people in a situation where they're just going to be like, this is war. Because if two sides cannot negotiate, they're either going to go to war, or are they or they're just going to separate. They're just going to say, okay, you guys go over there, we're going to go over here. And of course, there's a lot of talk about, both separation on the one side and war on the other side. Personally, if it ever does come to that, I would rather that we peacefully um, go the path of separation than war. Of course, this is a point that Douglas Murray brought up, was the fact that over the years, the right has been fighting losing battles, and Trump showed the right how to win battles. And so we must keep that in mind, that if we want to understand what's happening, and the the common expression that I hear a lot is that the reality on the ground is that the right is going forward, is going to fight harder, and is going to push to win battles. But in all of this left right battle, the West is going through a positive feedback loop, commonly referred, as the downward spiral. And I think that yes, we are in the West going slowly. We're descending into a downward spiral. I don't like it, and I'm the only way I see out of this is if we encourage more conversations, and if we encourage more people to talk uh, more person to person than um, these, online chats in the internet. Because I think if we as a society allow people to air the different ideas that are cooking in their head, and they talk to other people, that we could dampen. And a lot of the time, a lot of people say a lot of things on the net or anything, but if they you know were treated with an amount of respect, and their ideas were heard without being strawmanned, and that they had a good conversation, I think about 10 to 20% of the tension would just be released, only on the grounds that people would feel that they've been heard. And a 20% release, again, that's my estimate, but that's my belief. On top of it, we could actually find solutions once people started talking to each other, instead of talking on the internet through this um, rabbit hole, where they're further, once people go into these conspiracy theory rabbit holes, and they start amplifying each other, and that is not good for society. These different groups, let's just say, of people, they need to interact with each other within the framework of respect. And I think this is probably the point that had the most, how should I say, influence on me, the most impact on me, is that forgiveness. This is a point that Professor Peterson brought, was the fact that forgiveness is the only way in which we do less harm. And a society where there is no forgiveness is a society not worth living. And and that's the problem. The identity politics crowd doesn't seem to understand that they are creating a society where there is no forgiveness, there is no redemption. And if they succeed in having that kind of a society, they're going to find there's going to be a lot of people who will ask themselves the question, that is such a society worth saving? And I don't believe that the answer to that question is going to be something that anybody wants to be asking. Anyhow, that's it for this video. If you liked the video, then hit that like button and hit that subscribe button for future updates. Write in the comment sections your thoughts, criticism, and anything that you thought I should have included in this small presentation. And of course, I will be looking forward to your comments, and hopefully I can encourage people to be uh, more freedom of speech. I'd like to encourage that kind. And I will see you in the next video.